Disney had the chance to create a great villain, but instead, they gave us Nalo, a forgettable mess with no real threat. Today, we're breaking down exactly why he fails as a villain and what Moana 2 teaches us about bad writing.
Show our people just how far we'll go.
Let's start with the problem with Nalo. There's no shortage of opinions on Moana 2, but if there's one thing we can say with absolute confidence, it's that Disney has outdone itself, in the worst way possible. We've already seen two of the most poorly written villains in animation, and somehow, against all odds, they've managed to deliver one that's even worse. Meet Nalo. Or, well, try to. Because this character is so underdeveloped and directionless that even calling him a villain feels generous. At first, the movie tricks you into thinking Bat Lady is the main antagonist. She's got the dramatic entrance, the big showdown with Maui, and that ominous air of mystery that suggests she's the one pulling the strings. But nope, turns out she's just a side character thrown in to mislead the audience. The real villain? Nalo, who spends most of the movie lurking in the background, waiting for his grand reveal, which doesn't even happen in the movie. Instead, we get a post-credits scene that suddenly introduces him as a demigod, as if anyone was still paying attention at that point. The problem with Nalo isn't just that he's a bad villain, it's that he barely exists in the story. There's no build-up, no clear motivation, no defining moment that establishes him as a threat. He's just there when the plot needs him and forgotten when it doesn't. If there's one thing Moana 2 teaches us, it's exactly how not to write a villain. So, who is Nalo? Great question. Too bad the movie doesn't have a real answer. From the start, Nalo is tied to electricity. At least, that's what we're supposed to believe. Moana gets struck by lightning, which should be a big moment that signals some kind of deeper connection between her and the villain. But instead of making that clear, the movie fumbles the setup so badly that it's impossible to tell if the lightning was a deliberate message or just a freak accident. Did Nalo want Moana to find him? Was this some grand plan? Or was it just a flashy scene with no real meaning? No explanation is given, and by the time the movie finally circles back to Nalo, it's too little. Too late. And if that wasn't confusing enough, the film doesn't even introduce Nalo properly at first. Instead, we get a long build-up for another character, Matangi, the Bat Lady. She's set up as the primary antagonist. She fights Maui, has a mysterious aura, and seems to be the force behind the movie's storms. Only later do we find out she's just some side character, and Nalo was the real villain all along. But here's the kicker. Even after we do learn about Nalo, we still don't know him. His presence is so inconsistent that he feels more like an afterthought than a true antagonist, and that, right there, is the core of the problem. How can a villain be menacing if the audience barely even knows he exists? It's the fake-out villain problem. The biggest issue with Moana 2's villain isn't just that Nalo is underwhelming, it's that the movie actively hides him, and by the time we finally meet Nalo, the damage is already done. Matang, the alleged villain, fights Maui, and the storm rages around her. So naturally, it makes sense to assume she's the one controlling it. The audience has no reason to think otherwise. Why would we? The movie doesn't bother to introduce any other real antagonist, and then, at the last second, it throws in a surprise. Turns out Nalo was the real mastermind behind the storm, but instead of this being a well-executed twist, it just feels like a cheap trick. Here's where things get worse. We barely see Nalo at all. There's a cardboard cutout of him in Maui's song. Then he's just some vague storm entity for most of the movie. And when do we finally get a proper look at him? The post-credits scene. That's right. After sitting through an entire movie supposedly about his conflict with Moana, we only get to really meet him after the credits roll. It's like Disney thought they were setting up some grand reveal, like a Thanos-style teaser for the Moana cinematic universe. But instead of making him feel like a looming threat, they made him feel like an afterthought. If the movie itself doesn't even care about Nalo, why should the audience? Let's do a bad villain versus good villain. Moana 2 tries to follow in the footsteps of the first film, but instead of building something new, it just feels like a weaker, sloppier version of what worked before. And Nalo is a poor excuse for a villain, especially when compared to Te Kā. Te Kā wasn't just a threat, she was a force of nature. The movie made it clear that she was dangerous from the start, and every moment she appeared she felt like an unstoppable force. But the best part? She wasn't just a random villain thrown in for conflict. Her presence made sense. The big reveal that she was actually Te Fiti the whole time worked because it tied into the story's themes. It wasn't just a twist for the sake of a twist, it was meaningful. Now, look at Nalo. He has none of that. The movie wants us to think he's some powerful demigod, but we barely see him. He doesn't have a real presence, and his connection to the story is weak at best. Worse, his final battle is ridiculously easy. A good final boss should challenge the heroes, push them to their limits, and force them to grow. But Nalo? His fight may have been long, but it was forgettable. Nothing about it was exciting or impactful. At the end of the day, Moana 2 proves that a villain needs more than just cool powers or a dramatic reveal. They need purpose. But the real issue is the copy-paste plot. If the final battle of Moana 2 felt familiar, that's because it practically is the same one from the first movie, just done worse. Maui makes a big sacrifice. Moana has to finish things on her own, emotions run high, and in the end, everything is magically resolved. Sound familiar? Yeah, because we already saw this in Moana. The problem is that Moana 2 just takes that formula and applies it without understanding why it worked the first time. This time, Nalo isn't a force of nature. He's just a guy who throws storms around when it's convenient for the plot. His powers are inconsistent. Sometimes he's throwing lightning, sometimes he's just standing there. Even when he should have had the perfect chance to stop Moana, like when Lotta literally made the ship fly, he just lets it happen. No lightning strikes, no tornado to pull them back, nothing. It's like he only shows up when the movie remembers he exists. A great climax should feel like everything has been leading up to this one intense moment. Instead, Moana 2's final battle feels like someone copy-pasted the first movie's ending, forgot to change a few key details, and somehow made it way less exciting. So why is the final fight so easy? A villain's final battle should be intense and unpredictable and push the heroes to their limits. But in Moana 2, Nalo's fight is just long, not difficult. The movie stretches it out, not with actual tension, but by making Nalo disappear until the script needs him back. He shows up, causes some trouble, then vanishes again like he forgot he was in a fight. Maui losing his powers? Doesn't matter. He gets them back. Moana dying? Yeah, that lasts for about 3 minutes before it's undone. There's no real sense of danger because nothing sticks. The stakes are supposed to be high, but everything is reversed so fast that it never feels like the heroes were actually at risk. It's like a video game where you just respawn right before the final boss without any consequences. And let's talk about Nalo's fighting strategy, if you can even call it that. He has all this power, but barely uses it when it matters. He could have stopped Moana and Maui easily, but instead, he holds back, disappears, then lets himself get outplayed like he's a villain in a kid's board game. If you're going to make a godlike villain, at least let him act like one. Now let's sum up the core issue. A great villain should have clear motives, a strong presence, and a real threat factor. Nalo has none of that. He's just another generic, I hate humans character, except even he forgets that's his goal halfway through the movie. There's nothing intimidating about a villain who only loses because the plot says so. Nalo doesn't get outsmarted in a clever way. He lets himself be tricked because the movie needs an ending. His powers are all over the place, his personality is non-existent, and his presence is about as threatening as a storm cloud that just floats away when it's time for the sun to come out. For a Disney movie that's supposed to be a grand adventure, that's the biggest failure of all. So, what Moana 2 teaches us about bad villain writing? For villains to work, the audience needs to fear them. That fear comes from watching them overpower the heroes, outthink them, or at least make them struggle. As for Nalo, he's barely in the movie. When he does show up, it's not because he's actively hunting down Moana, it's because the script needs him to be there. The second the plot doesn't require him, he just fades into the background. This destroys any real tension. When a villain only appears when it's convenient, the stakes are meaningless. If the story can just pause the villain whenever the heroes need a breather, what's the point? Compare this to Moana's first villain, Te Kā. Her presence was constant. Every time Moana got closer to her goal, Te Kā was there, actively making things harder. That's what a villain should do. The worst part? Disney knows they can get away with this. As long as people keep buying tickets, they don't have to fix bad writing. They can just copy the same formula, slap a number at the end of the title, and rake in another billion. And unless audiences demand better, they'll keep doing exactly that. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.